The Origin Story of America, Birth of a Continent and a Nation. A note to the listener. Good evening. You are about to hear a historical narrative, the compelling story of the birth and rise of the United States of America. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the history unfold. Let us go back far beyond the stars and flags to the very beginning, when the land itself was being born. The birth of a continent. Long before the name America echoed through history, this land was silent, shaped by fire, ice, and time. Over 100 million years ago, titanic forces deep beneath the Earth's crust tore apart the supercontinent of Pangaea. From the molten chaos emerged a new landmass, the ancient core of what would one day become North America. Glaciers carved mountains, rivers found their paths, and forests began to grow. This was nature's canvas, raw, vast, and untouched by man. For tens of thousands of years, animals roamed freely across this wilderness. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant bison. Then came humanity. Around 15,000 years ago, small bands of nomadic hunters crossed a frozen bridge of land, the Bering Land Bridge, connecting Asia and Alaska. They did not know it, but they were the first people to set foot on a continent that would one day change the world. The first peoples of the land. Over centuries, these early settlers spread across mountains, plains, and forests. They built homes, communities, and spiritual systems deeply tied to nature. From the Inuit of the Arctic to the Mayans of Mesoamerica, from the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley to the Navajo and Iroquois nations, this land was not empty. It was filled with vibrant cultures, languages, and civilizations. They lived in harmony with the land, guided by respect for the sun, moon, wind, and rain. They did not seek to conquer the earth, but to live as part of it. They told stories of spirits and ancestors, of great hunts and sacred mountains. Their wisdom would later echo through centuries, as a reminder of what was lost and what endures. The Age of Discovery. The silence of the Old World was broken in 1492. A man named Christopher Columbus, sailing under the flag of Spain, crossed an ocean and reached the Caribbean islands. He thought he had found Asia. Instead, he had stumbled upon a new world, one that would ignite a wave of exploration, conquest, and colonization. Within a century, European empires, Spain, France, England, and others, began to lay claim to the vast lands of the Americas. They came seeking gold, glory, and God. Ships arrived filled with explorers, missionaries, and soldiers, and behind them followed settlers, merchants, and dreamers. The native peoples who had lived here for millennia faced a storm unlike any they had ever known. Disease, displacement, and war. This collision of worlds would forever change both sides of the Atlantic. The seeds of colonization. By the early 1600s, England began establishing permanent colonies along the Atlantic coast. In 1607, Jamestown, Virginia, became the first lasting English settlement in North America. The Pilgrims followed in 1620, landing at Plymouth Rock aboard the Mayflower, seeking freedom to worship God in their own way. These were humble beginnings, small wooden houses, harsh winters, and uncertain futures. But they carried within them the seeds of a new civilization. 13 colonies grew, each unique, each wrestling with questions of faith, survival, and identity. They built towns, farms, and trade routes. They fought against hunger, cold, and the native peoples they often misunderstood. Yet through struggle, they began to develop a sense of unity, a belief that they were something different from those who had sent them across the sea. The spark of revolution. By the mid-1700s, the colonies had prospered, but tension grew between them and their mother country, Britain. The Crown imposed taxes and laws from across the ocean, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and more, without giving the colonists any voice in Parliament. The cry rose, no taxation without representation. Protests turned to anger, anger to defiance. On a cold December night in 1773, patriots disguised as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped British tea into the water, the Boston Tea Party. It was an act of rebellion that set the world on fire. Soon after, gunfire erupted at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the first battles of the American Revolution. The colonists, ordinary farmers and craftsmen, took up arms against the mightiest empire on earth. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but not outwilled. The birth of a nation. On July 4, 1776, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to sign a document that would forever change history. the Declaration of Independence. Written by Thomas Jefferson, it began with words that still echo through time. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. With these words, a new idea was born, that government should exist not to rule over people, but to serve them. That liberty was not granted by kings, but was the right of every human being. For 8 long years, America fought for that promise. Led by George Washington, the Continental Army endured brutal winters, hunger, and near defeat. But in 1781, at Yorktown, they achieved victory. Britain surrendered. A new nation had taken its first breath, the United States of America. Building the Republic. Winning freedom was only the beginning. The next challenge was building a government that could hold 13 independent states together. In 1787, in the same city where independence had been declared, the U.S. Constitution was written, a blueprint for democracy that balanced liberty with law. Washington became the first president in 1789. Under his leadership, the young nation found its footing. The Capitol was built, the economy stabilized, and the dream of a republic took shape. Yet the founders knew this was an experiment, fragile, imperfect, but full of hope. The expansion of the frontier. As years passed, America began to grow, westward across rivers, mountains, and plains. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the country. Explorers like Lewis and Clark journeyed into uncharted lands, guided by the native woman Sacagawea. Settlers followed, farmers, gold seekers, and families chasing the promise of a better life. But this expansion came with a cost. Native nations were pushed from their lands, forced to walk the trail of tears. The soil of the New World was rich, but it was soaked in sorrow and struggle. Still, the American identity continued to form, built on ambition, courage, and contradiction. The struggle for equality. By the mid-1800s, the nation faced its greatest moral crisis, slavery. In the southern states, millions of African men, women, and children were enslaved to build an economy of cotton and tobacco. In the north, abolitionists cried for freedom. The conflict deepened until in 1861, America went to war with itself, the Civil War. It was brother against brother, North against South. For 4 years, the land was drenched in blood. Over 600,000 lives were lost. But in the end, the Union triumphed and slavery was abolished. President Abraham Lincoln, who gave his life for the cause, spoke words that defined a nation reborn. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. A new century, a new power. After the war, America began to rise with unstoppable force. Factories roared. Railroads stretched from coast to coast, and immigrants poured in from every corner of the world. Italy, Ireland, China, Germany, each bringing dreams of freedom. The Statue of Liberty stood tall in New York Harbor, whispering, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." The 20th century saw America face new challenges. 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the fight for civil rights. Through struggle and sacrifice, it became a beacon of democracy, science, and human spirit. Men walked on the moon. Voices like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of justice and equality. And despite all its flaws, the American experiment endured. The legacy and the promise. Today, the story of America is still being written. It is a story of contradictions, freedom and inequality, prosperity and struggle, unity and division. Yet beneath it all, there remains a common dream, the belief that no matter where you begin, you can shape your own destiny. America was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be possible, a living idea that freedom, though fragile, is worth fighting for. And so, as the sun sets behind the mountains and the flag waves in the wind, the spirit of the first settlers, the revolutionaries, and the dreamers lives on. A nation still searching, still striving, still believing. This is the origin story of America, not just of land and borders, but of ideals, of courage, and of the unending pursuit of a more perfect union. A journey beyond ice and time. Imagine a world frozen in silence. The year is not written in any calendar, and the earth itself is locked in the grip of a great ice age. Massive glaciers stretch for miles, swallowing mountains, freezing rivers, and blanketing continents. This is a time before civilization, before nations, before names, Kanadan, when humankind was still discovering its courage. Far to the northwest, where Asia meets the Arctic, a narrow land bridge connects 2 vast worlds, one known, one waiting to be found. This was the Bering Land Bridge, a frozen corridor of hope, stretching nearly 1,000 miles between Siberia and Alaska. And across this icy expanse, the first footsteps of a new chapter in human history began. The Great Migration begins. Around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, bands of hunter-gatherers in eastern Siberia followed herds of mammoth, reindeer, and bison across the tundra. They were not explorers, and at least not intentionally. They were survivors, driven by hunger, curiosity, and instinct. Their eyes, hardened by the cold, looked upon a horizon that had never before known human presence. The world they entered was harsh, yet alive. The skies were painted with auroras. The frozen winds carried the cries of wolves. Each footstep upon that icy bridge echoed into eternity, as these travelers unknowingly became the first Americans. They carried with them stories, tools of stone, fire for warmth, and hope for tomorrow. They didn't know that their descendants would one day fill 2 continents, from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, shaping 1,000 cultures, 1,000 languages, and a world beyond imagination. Life on the edge of the ice. The journey was not swift. It took generations. Children were born along the way, tribes divided and reunited, and knowledge passed through stories told by the firelight. They hunted mammoths and giant bison, fished through ice holes, and crafted shelters from bones and hides. For them, the Bering Land Bridge was not a crossing, and it was home. They lived there for centuries, waiting for the glaciers to melt and open new lands further south. Theirs was a life of adaptation and courage. To survive in that endless white, they learned to read the wind, follow the herds, and respect the spirits of the land. Even as temperatures fell to impossible lows, they pressed on, believing that somewhere beyond the snow lay a world of abundance. That belief, that faith in the unseen, was the spark that would ignite the story of the Americas. The new world awaits. As the earth began to warm, glaciers retreated and the Bering Land Bridge slowly disappeared beneath rising seas. The path that had once united continents was gone forever, drowned under what we now call the Bering Strait. But the people who had crossed it, the ancestors of today's Native Americans, had already begun to spread across the new continent. They moved southward into the open plains and forests, following rivers that led to fertile lands. They learned to hunt the buffalo, gather fruits and roots, and craft tools that fit their new environment. The Arctic people adapted to the cold tundra and icy seas. Others, moving farther south, discovered green valleys, deserts, and mountains that seemed to touch the heavens. Everywhere they went, they left signs. Stone spear points buried in soil, cave paintings hidden from time, and legends whispered from one generation to the next. The rise of early American cultures. As centuries turned into millennia, these scattered tribes grew into distinct cultures, each shaped by the land they called home. In the vast plains, people followed the rhythm of the migrating herds. In the forests, they built wooden lodges and canoes, mastering the rivers. In the deserts, they carved homes into cliffs and learned to store water for seasons of drought. Agriculture emerged in the fertile regions of Central America. Maize, beans, and squash became the foundation of early civilization. From those seeds would rise powerful societies, the Olmecs, Mayans, Aztecs, and later the Inca in the far south. But even long before these empires, the spirit of the first migration lived on, a spirit of resilience, adaptation, and discovery. The land that remembered them. Long before the names America, Canada, or Mexico were ever spoken, this land was already ancient with stories. The mountains, rivers, and canyons had seen the footsteps of its first children. Their presence shaped the soil, the forests, and the language of the wind. When we walk through the tundras of Alaska or the plains of Montana today, we are treading on the memories of those who came before, the original discoverers of this continent. Their journey across the ice is not just a chapter of migration, it is a chapter of human courage, proof that survival is written deep in our bones, echoes of the ancestors. Archaeologists still uncover traces of their lives, arrowheads carved from obsidian, tools made from antler and bone, ancient footprints preserved in mud. Each discovery whispers the same message. We were here, we endured. From the Clovis points of New Mexico to the remains of ancient camps in Alaska, science continues to confirm what legend long held true, that the Americas were born not through conquest, but through migration, endurance, and faith. And the descendants of those first travelers still live today: the Inuit, the Cherokee, the Navajo, the Lakota, and countless others, each a living echo of that original crossing. The meaning of the journey. The story of the Bering Strait crossing is more than a migration tale. It is a reflection of what it means to be human. To leave behind the known in search of the unknown, to risk everything for survival, to follow a horizon that promises nothing but possibility. Every nation, every civilization begins with such a moment, when people decide that fear will not stop them. For the first Americans, that decision shaped the destiny of continents. Their legacy reminds us that the roots of America go far deeper than 1776, deeper than any flag or frontier. They go back to the rhythm of footsteps on frozen ground, the beating of hearts in the dark of an endless winter, and the spark of human will that refused to die. The vanishing bridge, the eternal memory. When the Ice Age ended and the oceans rose, the Bering Land Bridge vanished, swallowed by the sea. But the memory of that crossing never disappeared. It lives in every mountain name, every tribal story, every song sung to the spirits of the earth. The ancient travelers did not know what America would one day become, but in a way they created it. For in their courage to cross the impossible, they laid the foundation for everything that followed. Every tribe, every culture, every dreamer who ever called this land home. So when we speak of the origin of America, let us remember, its first chapter was not written with ink and paper, but with footprints upon ice. Closing reflection. Close your eyes for a moment. Hear the sound of the Arctic wind. See the stars glinting on the frozen bridge of land that once linked two worlds. And imagine those first travelers, faces lit by firelight, eyes fixed on the unknown, stepping forward into history. That step, quiet, cold, and full of hope, was the first heartbeat of a continent. The beginning of everything that would come to be known as America. European arrival, Columbus's misguided journey. Prologue, a changing world. It was the late 15th century, an age of kings, empires, and restless seas. Europe stood at the edge of a new dawn. Empires like Spain and Portugal ruled the waves. Trade routes to India and China were lifelines of gold and spice. But the known world was small, bounded by myths, monsters, and maps that ended in oceans. The Mediterranean was crowded. The Silk Road, once the artery of world trade, had been choked by war and Ottoman control. Gold, silk, and spices from the east were growing scarce, and so a question began to whisper in the courts of Europe. Was there another way to reach the riches of the east? Among the dreamers and navigators of this age was an Italian sailor, ambitious, stubborn, and filled with divine conviction, Christopher Columbus. He believed the world was smaller than everyone thought, and that by sailing west he could reach the east. He was wrong, but in that mistake history would be rewritten forever. The dream and the doubt. Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy around 1451, a time when maps were filled with imagination more than accuracy. From a young age he was obsessed with the sea. He studied winds, tides, and ancient geography. He read the works of Ptolemy and Marco Polo, convinced that the distance between Europe and Asia across the Atlantic was short. But when he presented his idea, to sail west across the Atlantic to reach India, scholars and kings laughed. They said the ocean was endless, that no ship could carry enough supplies to make the journey, that dragons and storms guarded the edge of the world. Yet Columbus persisted. For nearly a decade he knocked on royal doors. Portugal, England, France, and all said no. Finally, he turned to Spain, where King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, newly united under Christianity after centuries of Moorish rule, saw in Columbus's dream both wealth and divine mission. In 1492 they gave him their blessing, and 3 small ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The voyage into the unknown. The morning of August 3, 1492, dawned bright over the port of Palos de la Frontera. Sailors crossed themselves, families wept, and Columbus raised his eyes to the horizon. With about 90 men, he set sail into the great Atlantic, into waters where no European had ever ventured so far west. For weeks they sailed under blazing sun and endless blue skies. The ocean stretched without end, waves, wind, and silence. As days turned into nights and nights into terror, fear grew among the crew. They whispered that the world might truly be flat, that they would fall off its edge. Mutiny was close, but Columbus, unyielding, calmed them with faith and promise. "Hold fast," he said, "for God is guiding us." Then on the night of October 11th, 1492, as the moon glimmered over calm seas, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana shouted from the Pinta, "Tierra, tierra, land." The next morning they saw it, green shores, white sand, and people watching them from the beach. After more than 2 months at sea, they had found land. Columbus fell to his knees, kissed the ground, and thanked God. He thought he had reached the outer islands of Asia, but he was standing in the Bahamas in the doorway to a new world. The meeting of two worlds. As the Europeans stepped onto the sand, they met the first inhabitants of this new land, the Taino people. They were gentle, curious, and welcoming. They wore gold ornaments, which immediately caught the sailors' eyes. Columbus wrote in his journal, "They are loving people. They would make fine servants, and with 50 men we could subjugate them all." It was a chilling prophecy. To Columbus, these people were not equals, they were subjects. He believed he had reached the Indies, and so he called them Indios, a name that would cling to indigenous peoples for centuries. The Taino greeted the newcomers with food and gifts, not realizing that their generosity would mark the beginning of their end. Within a few years, their islands would be transformed by conquest, disease, and greed. The return and the deception. Columbus returned to Spain in 1493, bearing tales of exotic islands, gold, and docile natives. He carried parrots, fruits, and even a few captured Tainos to present before the royal court. Europe erupted with excitement. The king and queen hailed him as Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was promised more ships, more men, and more authority. Columbus believed he had reached the edge of Asia. He called it the Indies. But others began to doubt. Cartographers soon realized he had found something entirely different. A land unknown to Europe, Africa, or Asia. A new world. Yet in his pride, Columbus never admitted it. He died believing he had found a western route to Asia. The shadow of exploration. With Columbus's return, the floodgates opened. Spain, Portugal, England, France all sent expeditions across the Atlantic. Each voyage carried priests, soldiers, and dreams of empire. But behind the shimmering words of exploration lay a darker truth: conquest. Within decades, indigenous civilizations that had thrived for thousands of years were shattered. Diseases like smallpox swept through villages, wiping out millions who had never known such sickness. European weapons and slavery destroyed entire cultures. The Spanish conquistadors, following Columbus's path, marched into the heart of the Americas. Cortés in Mexico toppling the Aztec Empire. Pizarro in Peru defeating the Incas. Gold and silver poured into Europe, fueling its renaissance. But it was blood that paid the price. The myths and the misunderstandings. For centuries, schoolbooks celebrated Columbus as the discoverer of America. But how can one discover a land already filled with nations, languages, and civilizations? To the indigenous peoples, the arrival of the Europeans was not discovery. It was apocalypse. Entire worlds were erased, temples burned, knowledge lost, children enslaved. The Taino, who had once welcomed the strange visitors from the sea, vanished within decades. And yet, this painful collision of worlds gave birth to the world we know today. A tangled legacy of destruction and creation, faith and greed, light and shadow. The Americas became a meeting ground of continents, a crucible where cultures clashed and merged. The Age of Empire. As the 1500s unfolded, European ships swarmed the Atlantic. Spain claimed vast territories in the Caribbean and South America. Portugal colonized Brazil. France explored the northern rivers. England settled along the eastern coast. Colonial powers carved the map of the New World as if it were empty, drawing borders across lands they barely understood. They brought Christianity, iron, and gunpowder, and demanded gold, sugar, and slaves in return. The once pristine lands of the Taino, Arawak, and Carib peoples became plantations and ports. New diseases, new gods, new languages, and everything changed. And in that transformation, the old world of the indigenous peoples began to fade into memory. Columbus's legacy, a continent transformed. Columbus's mistake, thinking he had reached India, reshaped the course of human history. Because of him, Europe turned its gaze westward. Nations rose and fell on the riches of the New World. Slavery, colonization, and trade turned the Atlantic into a highway of both hope and horror. The Columbian Exchange and the vast transfer of plants, animals, and ideas changed both hemispheres. Potatoes, corn, and tomatoes flowed east to Europe. Horses, wheat, and smallpox flowed west to America. The balance of the planet shifted, and in ecosystems and economies and power. And somewhere beneath all of it lay the quiet memory of the first handshake between the Taino and the sailors from across the sea. The first meeting of two worlds that would never be the same again. The man behind the myth. History has judged Columbus in many ways as a visionary, a hero, a villain, a fool. The truth is complex. He was a man of his time, devoutly religious, dangerously ambitious, and often cruel. He enslaved indigenous people, punished dissent among his own men, and claimed divine authority for his actions. Yet his voyage marked the beginning of global connection, the moment when the continents of the world became one story. In that sense, Columbus was both the creator and the destroyer, the one who opened the door and unleashed the storm. Epilogue: the dawn after the storm. In the centuries that followed, the world Columbus accidentally unveiled would give rise to nations, revolutions, and dreams of freedom. But before America could be born, it had to be found, and before it could be found, it had to be taken. That paradox lies at the heart of this story, the courage of discovery intertwined with the cruelty of conquest. When we speak of 1492, we remember not only a sailor guided by stars, but also the countless voices that were silenced beneath those stars. The story of Columbus is not the beginning of America. It is the beginning of its awakening, its conflict, and its conscience. As the ships of Europe vanished into the horizon, the waves closed behind them, leaving two worlds forever bound by fate. This was not the discovery of a new world. It was the collision of two old ones, and from that collision, the long, tumultuous birth of America had truly begun. The naming of the continent Amerigo Vespucci. Prologue: the question that would not die. It was the dawn of the 16th century. The sails of European ships now crossed the Atlantic like clouds, carrying explorers, soldiers, and dreams of empire. The New World, as they called it, glittered with mystery, but a question still lingered in every royal court and scholar's study. What exactly had Columbus found? Was it India, as he claimed? Was it China? Or perhaps a chain of islands off its coast? No one knew. The maps of the world were trembling under the weight of discovery, and no one could make sense of it. Among those who dared to question the legend of Columbus was another Italian, a quiet thinker and observer, and a man whose name the entire world would one day carry: Amerigo Vespucci. The man behind the name. Amerigo Vespucci was born in Florence, Italy, in 1454, a time when the Renaissance was turning Europe into a workshop of ideas. He was not a nobleman, not a soldier, and not even a sailor by trade. He was a scholar, a merchant, and a lover of maps. He worked for the powerful Medici family, managing trade routes and learning the secrets of navigation. But like Columbus, he too was drawn by the sea, by the mystery of what lay beyond the western horizon. When news spread that a Genoese sailor had crossed the Atlantic and found the Indies, Vespucci's curiosity caught fire. Something, he felt, did not fit. The lands described by Columbus, lush, vast, filled with strange animals and people, did not match anything in Asia. And so, in the spirit of discovery that defined his age, Amerigo Vespucci set out to see the truth for himself. The Voyages of Vespucci. Between 1499 and 1502, Vespucci joined and led several expeditions to the coasts of what we now know as South America. He sailed under both the Spanish and Portuguese flags, mapping coastlines, observing stars, and recording every detail he saw. His letters and journals describe an astonishing world. Wide rivers broader than any in Europe, forests that seemed endless, constellations unseen in northern skies, and people, many different nations speaking hundreds of tongues, living in ways that seemed both strange and sophisticated. He wrote of Brazil, of Venezuela, of lands that stretched so far south they curved away beneath the horizon. It was then that realization struck him. This is not Asia, this is a new world, a new continent unknown to our ancestors. Vespucci's mind burned with the magnitude of what he had found. He had not simply reached a new route to the Indies. He had identified a new part of the earth, a new world revealed. Vespucci's account spread quickly through Europe. His letters, written with clarity and awe, were translated, copied, and distributed in cities from Lisbon to Nuremberg. They described not the coast of Asia, but an entirely separate land, vast, wild, and magnificent. He wrote of stars unseen from Europe, of climates that changed with latitude, of coastlines so long that they could not possibly belong to an island. He called this place Mundus Novus, the New World. To the scholars of the time, his argument was revolutionary. Columbus had opened the door, but Vespucci was the first to recognize that the door led somewhere entirely new. His words changed the way people looked at the planet. For the first time, humanity began to understand that the Earth was far larger and more diverse than anyone had ever imagined. The map that changed everything. In 1507, a group of German scholars working in the small town of Saint-Dié-des-Vosges published a New World map. Among them was a cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller. Waldseemüller and his team had read Vespucci's letters. They were struck by the Italian's reasoning, by his evidence that the western lands were a separate continent. And so when they drew their great map, they labeled this new landmass not as India, not as Colombia, but as America, in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, the man who had recognized the truth. The map, titled Universalis Cosmographia, was the first to show two separate continents in the Western Hemisphere. It was bold, it was revolutionary, and it would forever fix the name America in the human imagination. No king decreed it, no army enforced it. It was a choice made by scholars, by cartographers and thinkers who dared to trust the evidence of reason over the pride of power. The power of a name. At first, few noticed. Only 1,000 copies of Waldseemüller's map were printed. But ideas like winds travel faster than ships. Soon explorers and map-makers across Europe began to use the term America. It spread to atlases, books, and classrooms. And within a generation, America had become the accepted name for the lands across the Atlantic. Columbus had discovered the New World, but Amerigo Vespucci had defined it. It was his insight, and not Columbus's error, that gave identity to half the planet. Ironically, Vespucci never sought this fame. He never demanded that the continent be named for him. He was, in fact, unaware that his name had been chosen at all. The honor was given after his death, a quiet tribute from one mind to another, from scholars who valued truth above glory. A world reimagined. With the realization that a new world existed, the European imagination exploded. Explorers set out not just to find gold, but to chart geography. Scientists studied new plants, animals, and peoples. The Earth was no longer flat, nor was it divided simply between the Old and the East, and it was a globe filled with unknown wonders. Amerigo Vespucci's discovery shifted the very framework of human thought. It was no longer enough to believe in inherited maps and ancient texts. Now evidence, observation, and exploration defined truth. He had helped move humanity from the age of myth into the age of reason. And for that, his name, America, became not just a label on a map, but a symbol of discovery itself. The forgotten legacy. Ironically, Vespucci's fame would fade in his lifetime. He was appointed chief navigator of Spain, charged with training new explorers and maintaining the country's nautical charts. He worked quietly, methodically, never boasting of what he had accomplished. When he died in 1512, few celebrated him. The world still debated who truly deserved the title of discoverer. But history has a way of rewarding truth, even slowly. As centuries passed, scholars recognized the weight of Vespucci's insight. He had been the first to see what others could not, that the western lands were not an extension of Asia, but a new world altogether. Columbus found the shore. Vespucci found the truth. The meaning behind the name America. America. 6 letters that carry centuries of meaning. It stands for adventure, ambition, and discovery. But it also stands for contradiction, for conquest and conflict, for hope and heartbreak. When Waldseemüller inscribed that name onto his map, he could not have imagined what would follow. That America would one day become not just a place, but an idea. A dream of liberty, equality, and human possibility. A name that would rise above empires and define the modern world. And yet behind that grand name lies the simple story of a man who looked at the stars, measured the horizon, and dared to question what others accepted as truth. He is not naming a nation. He is naming a revelation, a new land, a new understanding, a new chapter in the story of humanity. And so it was that from one man's insight, the vastest of continents took its name, a name born not from conquest but from curiosity, not from power but from perception, not from Columbus's dream, but from Amerigo Vespucci's realization that the earth still held secrets yet to be known. Closing reflection. The name America reminds us that discovery is not about finding what we expect. It's about seeing what is truly there. Columbus sought India. Vespucci found a continent, and the world in turn found a new identity. Every time we say the word America, we echo a moment from 5 centuries ago, the moment when one mind dared to say, "This is something new." British colonization, the 13 colonies. Prologue, the tide of empire. The Atlantic Ocean lay like a mirror between two worlds, the old and the new. In the east stood Europe, proud and ancient, bursting with ambition. In the west waited a vast, untamed land, filled with forests, rivers, and endless possibility. By the early 16th and 17th centuries, the race was on. Spain had conquered the south. France had moved along the north and inland rivers, and England, small, damp, but burning with enterprise, turned its gaze across the sea. What began as a quest for fortune and fame soon became something far greater, the birth of a new civilization. Jamestown, the first footstep, 1607. In 1607, 3 small English ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, set sail from London, carrying 104 settlers. Their destination, a distant land known as Virginia, named in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. After months of hardship and storms, they reached the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and then sailed up a river they named after their king, James. There they built a settlement and called it Jamestown. It was no paradise. The summer heat was suffocating, the winters brutal. Swamps bred mosquitoes that carried deadly disease. Food ran short, and within months half the settlers were dead. Yet those who survived refused to surrender. They learned from the indigenous Powhatan people how to grow maize, fish the rivers, and survive the seasons. The colony struggled, burned, rebuilt, and endured. And with the arrival of John Rolfe and his experiments with tobacco, Jamestown found gold of a different kind. Cash crops, not coins. Tobacco became the lifeblood of Virginia, the first profitable export, and England's interest in colonization grew stronger. The Pilgrims and the Promise of Freedom, 1620. While Jamestown represented enterprise, another group came seeking something deeper, freedom. In 1620, a small ship named the Mayflower carried 102 English men, women, and children, pilgrims, fleeing religious persecution. They landed far north of Virginia, on the cold shores of Massachusetts, where they founded Plymouth Colony. Before stepping ashore, they signed the Mayflower Compact, a brief but powerful agreement declaring self-governance and unity under God. It was a fragile beginning, but symbolic, for here lay the seed of a radical idea. A people could govern themselves, free from the will of kings. The Pilgrims endured a harsh winter, nearly half perished, but the survivors were helped by the Wampanoag people, who taught them how to cultivate corn, hunt game, and survive. The following year, they celebrated their first harvest, a feast of gratitude and peace that would later be remembered as Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims endured a harsh winter, nearly half perished, but the survivors were helped by the Wampanoag people, who taught them how to cultivate corn, hunt game, and survive. The following year, they celebrated their first harvest, a feast of gratitude and peace that would later be remembered as Thanksgiving. Expansion and diversity, the 13 blossoms. Over the next century, the English planted colonies all along the Atlantic coast. By 1733, there were 13, each distinct, each with its own culture, economy, and spirit. Let us travel briefly through them from north to south to see how these settlements laid the foundation of a new nation. First, Massachusetts Bay, 1629. Founded by Puritans seeking religious purity, Massachusetts became a theocratic yet industrious society. Its people built schools, churches, and towns like Boston, where intellect, labor, and faith combined. The seeds of American education were planted here. Harvard College was established in 1636, the first institution of higher learning in the New World. 2. New Hampshire and Maine. Originally part of Massachusetts, These northern territories were filled with fishermen, trappers, and lumbermen, hardy souls living close to nature and far from royal control. See Rhode Island, 1636. Formed by Roger Williams, a preacher banished from Massachusetts for preaching religious tolerance. Here, freedom of conscience became sacred, a revolutionary idea that would later echo in the U.S. Constitution. 4. Connecticut, 1636. Built by settlers seeking more political independence, Connecticut drafted the Fundamental Orders, one of the first written constitutions in history. 5. New York, 1664. Once a Dutch colony called New Amsterdam, it was seized by the English and renamed for the Duke of York. Bustling, diverse, and cosmopolitan even then, New York was a place of traders and immigrants, the beating heart of commerce. 6. New Jersey. Split between Quakers and Puritans, it became a melting pot of ideas and ethnicities, a reflection of America's future diversity. 7. Pennsylvania, 1681. Granted to William Penn, a Quaker visionary who believed in peace, equality, and coexistence with native tribes. Pennsylvania's capital, Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, would later become the cradle of American democracy. 8. Delaware, a small but strategic colony with a thriving port, where Swedish, Dutch, and English settlers mingled. 9. Maryland, 1632. Founded by Lord Baltimore as a haven for persecuted Catholics, Maryland balanced faith and tolerance, another step toward the idea of religious liberty. 10. Virginia, 1607. The first and largest of the colonies, Virginia remained an agricultural powerhouse built on tobacco and the labor of enslaved Africans, a contradiction that would haunt America for centuries. 11. North Carolina and South Carolina. Developed from a single grant, these colonies thrived on rice, indigo, and trade with the Caribbean. They also became centers of plantation life, dependent on slavery yet rich in export wealth. 12. Georgia, 1733. The last of the 13, founded by James Oglethorpe as a place for debtors and the poor, a second chance colony designed to give new beginnings to the forgotten. The shadow of slavery. As the colonies prospered, a darker institution took root: slavery. Ships from Africa brought thousands of men, women, and children across the ocean in chains. They were forced to work on plantations under brutal conditions. This cruel trade enriched Europe and built the economic backbone of the colonies, but it also sowed moral conflict. For even as colonists spoke of liberty and freedom, they denied it to millions. This contradiction would later tear the nation apart, yet also drive it to redefine itself. Conflict and cooperation. Despite their differences, the colonies began to recognize shared interests. They faced threats from native alliances, French forces, and pirates along the coast. To survive, they had to cooperate. Trade flourished among them: timber from the north, rice and tobacco from the south, and ships from the ports of New England. Roads and communication grew, and slowly a sense of unity began to form. They were still English in name, but something new in spirit. Colonial Americans, a people halfway between subjects and citizens. The seeds of independence. England saw the colonies as sources of wealth, bound by loyalty and tax. But across the ocean, time and distance changed perspectives. Children born in Boston or Philadelphia no longer thought of themselves as Englishmen living abroad. They were Americans, shaped by a new land and new ideas. By the mid-1700s, tension simmered. The colonies had their own assemblies, their own ways of life, their own pride. The Crown's rules felt increasingly foreign. The taxes unfair, the interference intolerable. The same spirit that had driven the Pilgrims across the sea now whispered again, "We can govern ourselves." The first American identity. Within the fields, workshops, and meeting houses of the 13 colonies, a quiet transformation unfolded. Farmers, merchants, ministers, and craftsmen began to share a belief that this new land was not just an extension of England, but a place where destiny could be written anew. In Boston taverns, men debated freedom. In Virginia courtyards, planters discussed rights. Pamphlets spread ideas of liberty, natural law, and equality. And when war finally came, it would be these very 13 colonies, different yet united, that stood shoulder to shoulder to declare independence. Epilogue. From colonies to a nation. The 13 colonies began as fragile outposts, small dots of civilization along an endless wilderness. But within a century and a half, they had grown into a vibrant society of 2 million people. They built towns, governments, universities, and economies. They forged not only a nation, but an identity. Resilient, questioning, and hungry for freedom. The forests that once swallowed Jamestown echoed now with the words of revolution. And in those words, the world would soon hear the birth cry of the United States of America. But before that declaration, before the flag and the fireworks, there was the long, patient struggle of settlers, farmers, dreamers, and exiles who dared to build something new in the wilderness. Their story is not just about colonization. It is about transformation. It is about 13 scattered settlements becoming one destiny. The 13 colonies were not simply Britain's children. They were the architects of a new world, and the heartbeat of what would soon become America.